My name is Joshua Joshi Howard, and I have been a League of Legends color caster in the LCS Academy and now Challengers League space for the last several years. If you're not familiar with the League of Legends space, just know that there is a spring split and a summer split, and there's about a month and a half in between where we currently are. I'm currently in an off season. Now, with this time, I have a lot more free time to kind of do what I want, and one of the things that I have recently rediscovered a love for is Warhammer 40k, a tabletop miniatures war game set in the grim, dark future where everything is kind of bad. There's not a whole lot of good guys. It's really just about what can happen when a lot of different things seem to go wrong. While it can be played very much like a D&D kind of experience with a lot of roleplay, it can also be played as a competitive game somewhere in between like D&D and chess. Last month, I actually went to my first ever competitive event for this game, and I went 2-1. And one of the fun things that happened there was I won my first two games, and then in my third game, I actually played up against the #1 rated player in the world at the time. Imagine you're just going through your regular bronze, gold solo queue experience, and you just happen to run into somebody like Faker, or you're just going to a local chess tournament and you just happen to run into Magnus Carlsen. But you also don't know who that is. That was my experience at the first ever event, and it kind of ignited an opportunity for me to be like, oh, I could have given this guy a real game. Yes, he's clearly better than me, but with some work, I can actually challenge him next time. It's been a while since I've really tried to become good at a game. The last time I did it was with League of Legends, and then I also had opportunities to do that with smaller games like Secret Ponchos or Atlas Reactor, which were small indie games which unfortunately are no longer supported, but I was able to find my way into the upper echelons of those ladders. And now I'm having a ton of fun actually just playing a lot of Warhammer 40k, getting better at it, playing different people, and learning so much about the game every single time. For 6 weeks, I'll be going to a tournament every single weekend, and it will culminate in two two-day events towards the end of it, one held in Phoenix and one held here in Pasadena, California. And both of those will be having larger numbers of players, require more games being played, and will also be featuring some of the strongest players in one of the strongest regions we have here in the United States. My goal, obviously, is to do as well as I can, learn as much as I can about the game, and hopefully, maybe even win a couple of these smaller events along the way. And the personal goal that I have set for myself is to make it into the top 100 on the International Tournament Circuit rating board. After the last grand tournament in this 6-week project that I'll be going through, I will reevaluate what I actually want to do with 40k, but for now, I'm having so much fun. I really want to get good at this game that I've kind of just said I'm going to grind for the next several weeks in order to make sure I can do as well as possible at all of these events. For anybody who's watching that is less familiar with 40k and mostly just kind of want to know how I'm doing every single time, I will be leaving a summary at the end of the video for you to take a look at to basically just understand how well I did, what I learned about it, and what I'm looking to do at the next event. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the first event over that 6-weekend project that I went to in the first event, Game Ogre RTT, which I played on April 8th. Before we start taking a look at how I actually did at the event, let's go ahead and talk about the list that I brought. To start with, of course, it is an Arcs of Omen detachment with heavy support as my compulsory detachment slot that I've been bringing, and my regimental doctrine is Born Soldiers. For my HQ slots, I ended up taking all 4 slots completely filled, including Lord Solar Leontus with the Warlord trait Grand Strategist, whereby you can get a command point refund on a 5+ every single time you go for it, up to a maximum of 1 per battle round. Lord Solar is just so good at giving you so many extra free command points. He gives out so many orders. He is an incredible force multiplier across the entire list. Next, we also took a Cadian Command Squad. They had all the fixings, Medipack, Regimental Standard, Plasma Gun, and the Master-Vox. And importantly, I also chose to take the Relic, the Finial of the Nemrodesh first. A lot of people have been calling this the big bullshit banner, and it's also one of the best relics, not only in the Codex, but also in the entire game. It gives all of your core units the ability to ignore any 2-hit penalties, as well as ignore phase caps, feel no pains, damage reductions that people can take less damage once you actually wounded them and they've already taken their first save. For the other officer that we have taken in the HQ slot, we took a tank commander with heavy bolt responsons, a Lascannon on front, and the Relic Gatekeeper, the super battle cannon, on the front of the. For our last HQ slot, we end up taking a Primaris Psyker based on the recommendation that I received from Jason McKenzie, the #1 rated player that I played against at my previous event, with Psychic Barrier and Nightshroud. The first one is going to be giving a 5+ invulnerable save to a target within 12 inches, and then Nightshroud is a trans hitman. You cannot be hit on a 1, 2, or 3 on any dice roll for any reason. Our troop slots are fairly standard. We are going to be taking 4 times Cadian shock troops. They are all identical units with plasma gun, melt-a-gun, sergeants with a drum-fed autogun, and vox casters. These are my run-of-the-mill guys. They're going to be running around doing actions for things like raise the banner if I ever choose to go retrieve battlefield data, and anything of this similar sort. The elite slots, nothing particularly surprising here. We have 2 units of Kazarkin. The first unit will be featuring 2 volley guns, a Voxcaster, the Regimental Doctrine Veteran Guerrillas, whereby at ranges of 18 inches or less, they will be ignoring the benefits of cover on any targets, as well as the Relic Barbican's Key. The Barbican's Key allows me to pick them up once a game off the table, place them anywhere I want outside of 9 inches, and is a major core part of the Kazarkin bomb, which has been tearing up the competitive scene for a little while at this point, in conjunction with Lord Solar Leontus. The other unit of Kazarkin also features 2 volley guns, but has 2 plasma guns, a Vox, and the Regimental Doctrine heirloom weapons. These guys are a bit more of a flexible unit for me. I use them sometimes as line infantry, just place them in front of the Finial, march them outside of cover, and just open fire, and they're very good for dealing with units that have phase cap. Because they have heirloom weapons, they have an extra 4-inch range, and so it actually makes them a serious mid-board threat. But I can also bring them out from the side of the table as strategic reserves to just blow apart something on the side that I just really need to die. This next part in the fast attack slots is something that I kind of cooked up all on my own. So we're starting off with 2 units of 1 Scout Sentinel each with a plasma cannon, and that's it. Just bare bones. You put them out in front, you forward deploy them, and they create a lot of space. They're a headache for people with forward deployments, and they virtually guarantee that if I go first, I will have some place to put my Kazarkin with the Barbican's Key to teleport them on turn 1. But the part that is a bit more of a homebrew, something I'm a bit more excited about that I feel like I might have come up with, if I haven't seen anybody else do it, is 1 unit of 3 Scout Sentinels with heavy flamers and chainsaws. And the entire idea here is to make really strong use of the stratagem called Maverick Maneuvers. Maverick Maneuvers is a 1 command point stratagem whereby Scout Sentinels, or any kind of Sentinel, can move, shoot, and then move an additional 6 inches. And the entire point of this is they are going to be on turn 1, if I get to go first, they will be moving 12 inches into my opponent's deployment zone, blasting a whole bunch of stuff with fire, and then with the extra 6 inches, if I need it, virtually guarantee a charge onto all kinds of big hitters. These are for land fortresses, land raiders, enemy Leman Russes, just things to make it really obnoxious for my opponent to try and deal with this massive tar pit that is just suddenly in their deployment zone. Against things like enemy guard units or enemy gaunts from the Tyranids, it just cooks alive a whole bunch of them. It just makes it really easy to get this strike off, get a little bit of extra damage, but more importantly, just buy me an extra turn whereby I can move up into the midboard and not have to worry about my opponent's big guns just tearing me apart. And honestly, once I lose these guys, I don't really care. It's 135 points that I'm spending on the map in order to just take a ton of board control, make my opponent really sad, and if I don't go first and they all die, it's cool. It's 135 points. Obviously, I never want to lose anything that I don't have to, but I'm not really bothered by losing these guys. Their entire point is they are a screen. They make it hard for Votann jet bikes or the Pioneers to move forward. Anything that has forward deploy suddenly is just really struggling to take control of the midboard, and I really have been enjoying them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we get to see how effective they can be. In the heavy support slot, my compulsory slot that I did take, I took 3 units of 3 mortars each. These are really good for taking care of Eldar, these really low toughness things, Grots trying to do good bits in the backlines, anything that's just kind of sitting on a backline objective that I can basically always hit from indirect fire. I don't need line of sight in order to hit them, and it makes it really difficult for some units to actually deal with trying to hold their own backside of the map. You don't want to be leaving guys back there, and it just creates a lot of indirect pressure on armies that sometimes just have no answer to it. After that, we have one unit of two Leman Russ battle tanks equipped identically, both with an Executioner plasma cannon on top, a Lascannon on the front, and heavy bolters on the sides. These guys are going to be some of the workhorses of the army, just trying to do a ton of damage across every single game. You put them in open fire lane. They're a little bit short range at 36 inches, but depending on the actual deployment, they're still going to be doing a ton of damage. The Strength 8 AP4 Damage 3 guns do a little bit of damage to almost everything. The only thing that they really have trouble dealing with is 4-up invuls and things that are toughness 9 or better. Lastly, in the heavy support, we have a Rogel Dorn battle tank with all the fixings. We took the Oppressor Cannon with coaxial autocannon on top. We've also taken the Pulverizer. It's a short-range battle cannon. You know, it's pretty cool. Heavy bolters, heavy stubbers, and crucially, I also give it the Vaunted Praetorian Tank Ace, whereby it counts as an officer for purposes of inflexible command, and also can order itself and other tanks that are around it. And so by taking this, I can now have my tank commander leading one set of tanks, and then I can have my Rogel Dorn on the other side of the battlefield, also giving out orders and ordering itself, so I don't even need to have Lord Solar or Tank Commander around it to make sure that it's always operating at peak capacity. Lastly, in no slot comes the Commissar, because I did take a Cadian Command Squad. It does not have to be in a Force Org slot. Commissar armed with a bolt pistol and a power sword. And I already know some people who might be listening to this are like, Joushi, why are you giving a power sword to a Commissar? That is so much better as a chainsaw on one of your sentinels. And I know. I was just feeling really lazy. The 5 points that we spent here on the power sword are basically irrelevant. It doesn't do a whole lot for the Commissar. It shouldn't be getting into melee combat very often anyway, but it's how I had already modeled the Commissar model, and I really didn't feel like lopping off an arm in order to put something new on it. So, you know, if I really wanted to optimize this list a little bit more, that is the first little place to do it. Get rid of the power sword here on the Commissar, put a chainsaw on one of the Plasma Sentinels, and it suddenly becomes not a threat in melee, but not bad. Now let's talk about the tournament itself before we actually get into how I did into any of my games. This was a game Ogre RTT capped at 16 players. Of the 16 that signed up, 15 actually showed up, and I did a little bit of research into my opponents before I actually went, and so I had some idea of what kind of lists and what kind of factions people would be bringing. It looked like most of the players there had an ITC ranking of some kind, but most of them weren't particularly high. It looked as though this would be kind of similar to me. Most people would be there as their first, second, maybe third event, and there were only one or two other players that were there that really struck me as somebody to kind of watch out for. There was only one player who I think had a ITC rating of above about 2,000, and that made me feel really comfortable. I took one look at it and said, well, these guys aren't necessarily fish. They aren't going to be people that are going to be the toughest of opponents. And so with that in mind, I was actually thinking about bringing a meme list originally to this of mostly Leman Russ battle tanks, but I saw what was there and I'm like, I think I can actually win this event. So I changed it up. I brought my most competitive list that I am currently fielding, and we'll see how that actually panned out. It's also worth noting during these events that here on the West Coast, we mostly are doing player-placed terrain, so that was in effect. The terrain was pretty good on the tables that I did actually play. It was reasonably dense. There was lots of obscuring terrain all over the place, and while one of the tables that I was on had some really, really big terrain pieces, it wasn't as though it felt unfair. It just was a situation where it created some really weird incentives. But overall, really enjoyed it. It wasn't the highest level competitive event, and with player-placed terrain, it kind of built up a lot of opportunities for both players to showcase a lot of skill on the board. So, again, overall, I came to this event with the idea that there aren't going to be any players here who are going to be dominating the field. We don't have any like top 100 ITC players already here on their own, and I came to them with the expectation that if I played well, matched up into the right opponents, I could potentially win the entire thing going into my second event. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start talking about Game 1. In Game 1, I played against Braxton and his Salamanders, and this was an interesting list. I will admit, one of my biggest weaknesses going into all of these events coming up is that I have not played against a variety of different armies. Again, I haven't really played this game since I was in high school, and I graduated in 2012. So it's been over a decade at this point since I've really played a whole lot of 40k. But going into this, I mean, I know salamanders, their whole thing is they have a lot of flamers, they have a lot of meltas, they are very close combat, medium range to in melee. And looking at his list, I was not particularly surprised at what I saw. It was Agatone, a chaplain, chapter master lieutenant, aggressors, blade guard, some eradicators, and a couple of Terminator assault squads. And so, looking at all of that, I kind of knew right off the bat that it was going to be a game where if I can create a lot of space whereby he has to charge at me through open terrain, I'm probably going to be winning. Then I saw what mission we were going to be playing, and it was Data Scry Salvage, and I was already thinking, oh no, this is going to be a bit of a tough one. Data Scry Salvage, you have corner deployment, and then there's one objective in both players' deployment zones, and then there are 4 spread out across the center line from corner to corner. That means that there's a lot of objectives right along the middle of the board that I will have to move out of my deployment zone to get. And to make things worse, on Data Scry Salvage with 6 objectives, it is a hold 2, hold 3, hold more. In order for me to score any points on primary, I will be needing to hold 2 objectives minimum every single turn. And being forced to move up the midboard into salamanders who have meltas and flamers at close range, that was a scary proposition. So we rolled off. I made a pretty big mistake right off the bat. I was so focused on trying to decide which one of the corner objectives I needed to hold in order to start scoring 4 points per turn on primary that I allowed him to set a massive piece of terrain right in the middle of the board, which limited my firing lanes pretty heavily from all of my tanks, and I was drastically outranging him, but also meant that he had a staging area whereby he could move up all of his relatively close range units, and then on turn 2 or turn 3, just burst out of the middle, make sure I could never take any of the 2 objectives that were towards the middle of the board, and I was already in a position where I was very, very worried. Secondaries from both armies. Braxton chose to take the Promethean Creed, Assassination, and Raise the Banners High. I, on the other hand, took, and this is going to be becoming a theme, Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Raise the Banners High. As we actually got all deployed, I had most of my army set up in my deployment zone. I just held some infantry in reserve in order to bring them onto the board a little bit later on so that I could actually score more boots on the ground points and try and make sure I could get 3 on as many turns as I possibly could to try and get 12 points off of that. So, turn 1, we are all set up. He has infiltrators in the back of his deployment zone with their 12-inch no deep strike bubble, which is really annoying to try and attack him with Kazarkin with. But he also gets to go first. So with all my sentinels on the line, are in the middle of the board, with most of my units otherwise deployed relatively conservatively, he wins the roll-off, and he starts rolling with his Eradicators up against my Sentinels, and amazingly, he hits so many shots going into my Flamer Sentinels, and then, at the half range with these multi-meltas, where they have 7 wounds per Sentinel, he rolls straight 6s on all of the melta damage. First multi-melta shot, d6 plus 2, rolls a 6, 8 damage, 1 Sentinel's dead. Second one, another 6, plus 2. That's 8 damage. I have no save. Another Sentinel dead. The third one, another 6. All 3 of the Flamer Sentinels just dead right off the bat. I guess, what they say, salamanders, they know what to do with fire, and in this case, it was kill it very, very fast. And so a lot of my early game pressure that I was trying to put out was drastically limited right off the bat. He was able to deal with most of what I had in the midboard, so basically all my Scout Sentinels were dead on turn 1. But it is what it is. He tried to push up a little bit, but in order to attack these Sentinels, he did have to expose some very crucial units. And on my turn 1, I moved up and realized very quickly I'm never going to be getting my Kazarkin bomb to go off in his backline in order to pick up everything that is available back there. But what I can do is I can drop them into the middle of the board and do a ton of damage to everything that is going to be running up and trying to deal with my infantry as they actually take some of these objectives. And I decided that I was going to be playing towards one side of the board, which was, for me, my left side. And so I dropped my Kazarkin, I picked them up and put them in the middle of the board. And I very quickly decided these Eradicators, yes, they're going to be very good at using their Meltas to kill my Rogel Dorans, my Leman Russ battle tanks, but I can place them outside of his effective range because they're mostly 24 inches, and I can shoot them with my tanks, which have 36-inch range on all of their guns or better. And so I decided to leave his Eradicators alive that he had actually set up. But what I did with my Kazarkin was I, one, obliterated his aggressors, like the jump pack infantry that he was going to try to jump forward, take some mid-board control, put them behind some line of sight blocking terrain. I annihilated some of his forward deploying infiltrators he had put on his Promethean Creed objective, and did some damage to Blade Guard as well. And so effectively, I annihilated 2 squads and took about half of his Blade Guard off the table on turn 1. And I was already feeling pretty confident. He was already feeling pretty worried just off of what I was able to do from there. And just with the amount of damage that we did, one thing that was really nice was that with Inflexible Command, because I was just plopping my Kazarkin into the middle of the board, I was still able to score 4 points on Inflexible Command with the only unit that was not in range being the one surviving Sentinel, which I had kind of moved over to a side and forgotten to move up a Tank Commander or, the Rogel Thor in order to try and make sure that everything was okay there. But still, I ended up scoring 4 points on Inflexible Command, and then of course you cannot score any boots or raise the banners, and so right off the bat, I was already looking at a pretty decent lead. Turn 2 rolls around, and I have pushed up my Rogel Thorn into the middle of the board, and Braxton decides he needs to take some gambles in order to win this game, and honestly, I would agree. All of his objectives really require him to move into the midboard, come into my deployment zone in order to try and make some space, and actually, bring the fight to me. Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, Inflexible Command, and Boots on the Ground, and even Raised Banners are so good at just passively scoring points, kind of for existing, that he needs to actually make sure that he can not only keep me off of the objectives in the midboard, but also keep me off of the corner objectives. And as long as I'm sitting on 2 objectives, the one in my home base, and at least 1 or 2 in the middle, I'm going to be scoring 4, 8, maybe even a couple 12 points per turn just off of primary, and that's going to be an issue. Also, data intercept, getting a couple points here and there during the command phase as well. But he decides to drop an assault squad of Terminators, one on for me, the top left objective, and another squad of Terminators on the bottom right corner objective. And he basically puts them in spots where they can try and move forward, deal a bunch of damage to my guys, and crucially, he put one set of Assault Terminators 9 inches away from one of my Rogaldorn battle tanks. And after a bunch of shooting, his Eradicators do a bunch of damage with their melt guns to my Rogaldorn through Trans Hitman, through the Psychic Barrier, basically bring it down to half, and then his Terminator squads fail their charge. Both the top left ones and the bottom right ones. Admittedly, 9-inch charges are not easy, but even with a CP reroll that he used on the top left one to try and get it into the Leman Russ, still failed it. So now these Terminator squads were effectively just sitting in the open. And on my turn 2, I obliterated both of them. And that was brutal. The other thing that managed to happen during his turn was he got his Blade Guard into a position where they were not ready to charge, but they had staged themselves in such a way that they could potentially charge my Rogel Thorn or Leman Russ or 2 on turn 3. I wasn't able to deal with them this turn, but effectively he just had some Blade Guard, the Infiltrator sitting in the back, his Eradicators, and his characters left. That was basically all he had left on the board. He really needed to try and make something happen at this point. So his turn 3 comes around, and he gets his Blade Guard in a position where they could charge some of my infantry and Leman Russ battle tank. Now, this Leman Russ still had the rerolls for Lord Solar, and I double checked this. This is something that is important to keep in mind, is that Lord Solar's rerolls that you give, and you point at one target and you give them to hit rerolls, and then if they're core, they also get to wound rerolls. That lasts until your next command phase. So it applies in Melee, it applies in Overwatch, it applies to everything. And so, as the remaining 2 Blade Guard get into a position to charge Leman Russ battle tank with one of my Executioners, I declare that I'm going to be shooting Overwatch because there are only 2 Blade Guard members left in this squad. and I roll an 8. So I roll a 5 on my number of shots, so I get 8 shots from the main gun. And I roll 4 sixes. And as an executioner with born soldiers, those are all auto wounds. That means I do not have to roll the wound. They're just going to be hitting AP -4. He gave them the Storm Shield, so they have this 4-up invulnerable. He fails all 4. And the Blade Guard get wiped. It's the most valuable Overwatch I've ever fired. It saved my Leman Russ battle tank. It made sure that he could never get into my lines. It made sure that he was not getting points on assassination. He was wiped. And that was effectively the game, right? The game didn't end at that point, but suddenly he didn't really have a whole lot left to actually get into my lines to create a whole lot of pressure on the board. Well, yes, his Eradicators spent the last of their shots. They picked up the Rogel Dorn. Eradicators aren't going to be able to move forward, and just because of the number of shots that they're putting out, they're not usually going to be killing an infantry squad per turn. And at this point, I had already taken control of my home objective and both corner objectives by bringing in infantry off the side of the board. And he didn't have a whole lot left. The only thing that he had that was a real threat to me at this point was Agatone. And Agatone does impact my lines. He picked up an infantry squad almost entirely by himself, created a lot of pressure, but at this point, he's in a position where he's getting countercharged by Lord Solar, and Lord Solar is surprisingly good in melee. 6 attacks hitting on 2s, strength 6, AP -3, 2 damage. Like, he's actually pretty good at dealing with characters in particular. And Agatone had taken enough damage that Lord Solar was able to pick him up off the board. And at this point, we basically both agreed. We kind of looked at each other. It's like, yeah, there's not a whole lot of play left here on the left side of the board on my turn 4. I was going to be able to bring my Leman Russes to positions where they could actually kill what was left of his Eradicators. He didn't have a whole lot left. All he had left was Infiltrators, and so at that point, Braxton did concede the game. We talked about the rest of it, and we realized a couple of things. One, he had been forgetting to do data intercept every single turn. And so for what data intercept is, you need a unit on your home objective, and then once you have that, for every no man's land objective that you have in the middle of the board, you get an additional point. He didn't do that a single time. And that would probably have gotten him somewhere in the neighborhood of like 9 to 10 points over the course of the game, because Space Marines do benefit from sticky objectives. You just need to control it once, and then until your opponent takes it from you, it does count as being yours. So that was definitely a rough spot from their game. But the other big thing was he didn't have a lot of ways to get into my back line. And on Datascry Salvage, that wasn't a huge issue, but he needed to recognize that on this mission, I did need to actually come to him. He did not need to come to me. He needed to control the midboard by using his staging pieces of terrain, and I was actually able to take the game with a final score of 83 to 52. Overall, I had a lot of fun in this game. Braxton was a great opponent. He said it was his second event. It was his second time ever playing Astra Militarum, and the first time he had played against the guard, he had lined up on the center line, lost the roll-off, and went second, and Leman Russ's pounded his entire line, and he was effectively tabled on turn 2. And that was, for him, a pretty big bit of growth to actually see that, yes, he wasn't tabled. He was actually still fighting for at least 2-3 more turns than he was initially expecting. And honestly, great guy. Really hope that he has a lot more opportunity to continue playing. Wasn't the best showing this time, but I have a lot of faith that he's going to grow very quickly. Having gone 1-0, it was time for me to start thinking about first lunch, right? After round 1 of these RTTs, you usually play one round, you go to lunch, and sometime during that lunch break, you will get to see what your next opponent will be. You get to take a look at their list, and you get some pretty good ideas of how you might be able to play up against them. And I saw that I was playing up against Jeff and his Eldari. Also saw that it was in 2 detachments instead of just the one Arcs of Omen like most people are going for. There was an Arcs of Omen Inari detachment and a Harlequins patrol. And it was striking scorpions, rangers, troops, some shining spears and shroud runners, the Incarn all in the Arcs of Omen, and then I believe it was a troop and some Harlequin characters I don't really remember. And oh, and then there were some D cannons in the Arcs of Omen detachment as well. And those things scare the piss out of me. I'm gonna be honest. Like those are 24-inch range, strength 12. I think it's D6 plus 2 shots. Like these things, if they can get in range, will be obliterating Lehman Russes. But the one thing that we do have to keep in mind is that D cannons, despite being pretty resilient, toughness 5, 5 wounds, they only have a 24-inch range. They actually have to come into me, and they really don't want to be shooting indirect, even though they can. Just because that is very limiting to their damage output, effectively getting a -1 to all their hit rolls, and a +1 to the Lehman Russ's save really hurts their ability to do damage. So with a 24-inch range, it's kind of like short-range super las cannons in some ways, and I probably ended up respecting it way more than I should have. But we'll get into that a little bit more. For this one, we were playing Recover the Relics, which, let's be honest, you guys, is one of the best, if not the single best mission for the Astra Militarum, for the Imperial Guard. It is a 6-objective hammer and anvil mission. So, hamburger, we both deploy on our short board edges, and the crazy thing about this mission is it's a hold 1, hold 2, hold more than your opponent. And that is so good for Astra Militarum. There are 6 objectives on the board. I only need to control 1 for 4 points. I need to control 2 for 8 points. And realistically, you are not going to be stopping an Imperial Guard player from scoring an absolute minimum of 32 points on primary every single game. Because the Guard player picks their home objective, they pick one objective that is close to them, and you're going to be controlling at least 2 the entire time. Like your castle can extend to control both those objectives the entire game. And so that was really good for me. Another thing, the tertiary objective is break them body and soul. And how that works is you get 1 additional primary point per unit that you kill per battle round, up to a maximum of 3. And again, we said guard players are scoring a minimum of 32 primary that way. If they're playing reasonably well, and let's say you kill 2 units every turn for the entire game, so it's 32 minimum just from sitting on your own 2 objectives, up to 42 of a maximum 45. Right, that is so good for an Astra Militarum player that Jeff was already looking at a massive uphill battle. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is, as Astra Militarum, and we'll talk about the secondaries real quick, my secondaries were Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Raised Banners. Again, very standard stuff coming from the Guard, but again, I'm going to be scoring 15 from Flexible Command every single time. Boots on the Ground, if I play very conservatively, I'm going to be scoring 8. And then Raised Banners, again, if I play very conservatively, I'm scoring 8 to 10. Right? That is a ton of points. That is 23, 31, plus 42. That is 73 points that I'm getting basically for doing nothing. Right? I basically just sit there and shoot at them. It is entirely on Jeff to dislodge me from my side of the... Oh, let's also talk about Jeff's secondaries. They are Behind Enemy Lines, Warp Ritual, and Bring It Down. It is worth noting that you cannot max 15 points off of my list for Bring It Down. My list only gives up 14 points. So even if he scored maximum on Bring It Down and Warp Ritual, that is 26 points. And then Behind Enemy Lines, he needs to get something in my deployment zone every single turn in order to max that one out, on top of like taking a whole bunch of objectives off of me in the process, right? This is a very tough mission for his list to actually beat mine. So as we deploy, we come out. I'm deploying very conservatively. In fact, having talked with one of my friends over lunch about the things I needed to look out for, my friend was saying that, yeah, Striking Scorpions, the D cannons, realistically, if Jeff has a couple of good turns, he's picking up 2 Lehman Russ battle tanks per turn, and that is a terrifying prospect. And so we agreed that probably makes most sense to start with a couple of my Lehman Russes off of the board and put them in strategic reserve. And so I did that. I deployed incredibly conservatively. I deployed almost everything behind Obscuring, and it is worth noting that on this terrain map, we had what I have heard colloquially called magic boxes. And these are ruins that have no windows and a roof. And so what you do is you just put units in them, and they can't shoot out, and they can't shoot in unless it's with indirect fire. And you know what my list has? Mortars. I'm able to just put a bunch of mortars in on the bottom floor of those buildings, and they are not shootable. right? He has to come in, he has to melee them, and that is a very scary prospect for basically any list to be forced to come into the entire guard line, come across the entire board, and try and deal with that. So, what I ended up doing, as I said, held a couple of Leman Russes in reserve, held some Khazarkane and some Cadians in reserve as well. Turn 1, we go. Oh, he deploys a couple of things in the middle of the board. You'll be able to see them in the pictures in that big, really big staging area terrain that he got because he was Defender. He got to place that as his first piece of terrain. Deployed his Harlequins behind it, and basically a bunch of things on the line, but obscured behind his really big building. And then we roll off. I do a very similar thing with my Sentinels, put them really far forward, and I go first. Jeff spends 2 command points, I believe the only 2 that he had at the beginning of the game, to redeploy a bunch of things out of the middle of the board. And I think that might have been the situation where we both kind of looked at each other and realized this game is probably over. He probably needed to go first in this game in order to reduce some of what we're about to talk about. But he picked up a bunch of things from the middle of the board, put some of them in strategic reserve, and on my first turn, my Heavy Flamer, my Alpha Striking Sentinels did their thing. They marched 12 inches into his side of the board, and already on turn 1, I was able to, between the Sentinels and my mortars, I eliminated a unit of Harlequin troops. I took a Striking Scorpion squad down from 5 to 2, and I was able to charge my Sentinels into one of his 2 units of D cannons. I believe they killed one, and then they tagged a whole bunch of things in melee to make it really difficult for them to fall back and shoot, or more importantly, to fall back and get into my side of the board. And realistically, that might have been enough to just kind of almost win the game at this point. He has so much that he has to deal with. I'm still scoring 4 on Flexible Command because it's only the Squadron Sentinels on the far side of the board that are not in range. Place my 3 banners because I'm already setting up for a really strong potential turn 1, and turn 2, and he's already caught in his own deployment zone by Imperial Guard. That's not really supposed to happen. On turn 1, when he comes out, he strikes back at the Sentinels, and it is terrible for him. Because as he's doing it, he's trying to move a whole lot of different things around his side of the board, which they can't. They can't move within engagement range of my Sentinels. That makes it really difficult for him to move around his side of the board. He yeets a couple of Shroud Runners over towards my side of the board. He knows he needs to go for some big plays, and so he brings them onto my side of the board. They kill about half a unit of infantry, do a little bit of extra damage, but because I've given a lot of my infantry the take cover order and they're already sitting in light cover, they also benefit from dense, so they have a +1 to their save and they're -1 to hit. The Cadian shock troopers are surprisingly resilient, but the Shroud Runners move in, tag a couple of things in melee, do a little bit of damage to a Sentinel, take down a couple more infantry. They do score behind enemy lines, but one of the most important things that we have in the game for the Astra Militarum is with Lord Solar and a Commissar, they have Prefectus orders. And one of the Prefectus orders gives platoon units fall back and shoot. And so, the Shroud Runners, even once they get in, they do a little bit of damage, they score them behind enemy lines, they're dead on the next turn. They have no way of getting out. And on turn 2, I effectively win the game. And the way this happens is on turn 2, the strategic reserves that I had as he tried to move up. He gets his first war patrol off with the Farseer. He moves his Incarn up after the Harlequins are wiped. On turn 2, I bring in, firstly, my Barbican Ski Khazarkhan that teleport from my side of the map over towards the left side of the board. I bring in a Tank Commander with Gatekeeper and Executioner Plasma Cannon, Leman Russ, off the left side of the board. And they have sight on his Howling Banshees, the Incarn, D cannons, a Farseer, and between the use of Ingrained Precision and the Overcharged Las Cells and these 2 tanks, all of that dies. It is all removed from the board. Then, on top of that, his Shroud Runners that have been set up on my side of the board that are currently scoring him behind enemy lines are picked up as well. he has almost nothing on my side of the board. He has a couple of Striking Scorpions, and he has, I think it's a Death Jester, some Harlequin unit that has made it over to my side of the board. And effectively, at this point, we both kind of look at each other and say, this game is going to be tough. He remarks at this point that he expects that while he can keep the score kind of close for the first 3 turns, by the time we hit turn 4, he will have run out of things. He will not have enough models. He will not have enough things to do. And so, on his turn 3, he gets his Death Jester in. He actually catches me with a rule that I did not know about, which is that heroic interventions do not require a combat to be going on. They just require that a character is within 3 inches of a unit of your opponent's. And so with that, his Death Jester was able to get in, finished off the other half that Sentinel had already taken off, and was able to remove one of my banners from the board at that point, just because I'd expected that I was going to be able to hold the objective because there was nothing OBSEC over there, and I had enough models over there to control it. But, you know, live and learn, lost a Sentinel, whatever, 40 points down the drain. I still have the rest of my army that I can still fight with. On his turn 3, he comes on, and we start seeing the Harlequin God, Segarak, the Laughing God, starting to have a really good time with his Striking Scorpions. Because the Striking Scorpions, they managed to get onto my bottom right objective, one of the ones that I was trying to kind of play for in my castle. And Striking Scorpions were able to take that from me. And as he moves in, he moves them into my big piece of terrain. Firstly, he tries to set up. He's setting up for a 6-inch charge onto my Commissar and Cadian Command Squad. It's a 6-inch charge. He rolls Snake Eyes. And the Laughing God is already cackling a little bit. Jeff spends one of his few command points, because remember, on this mission, on Recover the Relics, in order to get a command point, you need to control a no man's land objective. He spends one of, like, 4 CP, he has, like, the entire game, to re-roll the charge. And he rolls Snake Eyes again. And already at this point, the Laughing God is just laughing his ass off as these Striking Scorpions are now stranded right in the middle of my army, not able to get in. And immediately he's like, oh gosh, well, okay, we're not doing anything with that. Death Jester goes in, and this is when it actually kills the Sentinel. He rolls an 8-inch charge with the Death Jester, gets it into the Sentinel, wipes that in combat, and at that point, that's when he actually takes away the objective from me. But it's already a situation where we're starting to look at this situation. He needs these to go off. If he can wipe out the Commissar or the Cadian Command Squad or the Finial, it gives him this outside chance of maybe being able to take me down. But as we start going for it a little bit further, that's the end of his turn. He scores behind enemy lines. He gets his second Warp Ritual off, again by sending up a Warlock into the middle of the board, and then he uses Quicken to take it away so that I can't really see it. And then he also gets his Shining Spears into my Leman Russ and the Tank Commander on the side. And then, you know, my Kazakhin are picked up. He has enough ambient shooting to kill all those as well. And so he kills one Leman Russ, and he makes it so that my other Leman Russ cannot move because it's pinned up against the edge of the board. So as we finish up that, it is in a position where I am just trying to score as many points as I can, make sure that he cannot come over to me, score behind enemy lines for too many turns in a row. So on my turn 3, we get to see a little bit more laughing from Segarak, from the Laughing God, as I'm like, okay, there's only 2 Striking Scorpions left. I mean, they're not going to take that much shooting to actually remove them from the side of the board. I move my one remaining Cadian Shock Trooper left, move him over, and as OBSEC, he takes that objective back that his Death Jester is sitting on, raises a new banner on it, and I move some of my tanks a little bit farther forward in order to control the mid-board, make sure that we can pick up the Death Jester, and try and kill the Shining Spears that are currently tying up the Tank Commander as well. And I'm like, okay, we have 3 units of mortars back here. We have the Cadian Command Squad. We have the Commissar. Surely this is going to be enough to actually take down these 2 Striking Scorpions. But I left, just in case, I left my Rogel Dorn in a situation where it could still shoot the Striking Scorpions if they needed to. So, Executioner tank picks up Death Jester, no problem. Shining Spears get shot at. I pick up one of them with the Lascannon and Heavy Bolters on the Tank Commander. And then we start seeing all of the saves possible coming through from Jeff and his Striking Scorpions. I put all 3 mortars. That is 9 mortar shots. 9d6 shots going into the Scorpions. And for my first set of mortars, I roll a 4, a 1, and a 1. 6 shots. Nothing. I think he only has to make 1 save off of that. Second unit of mortars rolls a 4, a 2, and a 1. 7 shots coming through. And again, he passes all of them. Third mortar squad rolls. This one gets a 4, 3, and a 3. So 10 shots. About average for this one, finally. Puts some shots down. Makes every single save. Finally, I'm like, okay, these 2 striking Scorpions, they are clearly doing something right. Sagarak is absolutely laughing his ass off at this point, making sure that these 2 striking Scorpions are still alive. And I say, fine, my Rogel Dorn is going to put everything in. Presser Cannon actually only rolls a 1 for a number of shots. So a total of 4 shots, and they miss. I don't hit a single one. The Pulverizer Cannon, the Auto Cannon all go in. Don't hit any of those either. At this point, I'm starting to freak out. It's like, are these 2 striking Scorpions going to score him an extra 3 points, pick up my Cadian Command Squad, maybe do even more damage? Then we actually roll the Heavy Bolters, and we pick up 1. We get 1 striking Scorpion, but it's still the Exarch, or Autarch. Exarch, that is still currently sitting in the middle of my terrain piece, in the middle of my castle. He's just breached the doors. And I have to roll my 9 heavy stubber shots. I didn't expect to even get this far. And finally, I roll 5 6s and 2 5s on my heavy stubbers. And finally, we start rolling 1 by 1 in case Jeff wants to spend his last CP in order to actually keep this Exarch alive. He rolls the first one. Fails the armor save. Rolls the second one. Fails it again. At this point, he has 4 more saves that he needs to make. He's like, alright, fine. Roll them all at once. Rolls them. And he only fails 1. And he's like, well, Sagarak clearly wants something with his Striking Scorpion to keep him alive. Let's CP reroll that. And he fails it again. And it was literally the last shot from the Rogel Dorn. The heavy stubbers get on the 50 cal, actually coming through to take down the Striking Scorpion, prevent my opponent from scoring an additional 3 points off of it from behind enemy lines. That finally stops it. Then, on his turn 3, we actually have one of the most interesting situations I think I've ever come across in a game. And hopefully I will never have to be on the other side of this again, because it was a really awkward spot. Okay. Now, on Jeff's turn 3, the game is effectively over at this point. I already did so much damage on turn 2. He doesn't have anything that can really consistently get to me. He has the Shining Spear Exarch, which was able to kill the Lehman Russ Battle Tank Commander on my turn, because he did swing first. Did a ton of mortal damage, a ton of mortal wounds to it. But crucially, he does all of his movement. He only has a couple of things left. Brings in some Rangers and some Striking Scorpions. They pick up the Kazarkin squad that I have in the middle. The Rangers put a bunch of shots down range and kill a couple of Cadian shock troops that I placed on the right side of the board in order to score boots on the ground points. But the important thing that we actually saw was he had forgotten to move his D cannons. Okay, they were behind the big obscuring rune in the middle of the board. But he moved his 1 remaining Warlock that could still do anything, that could still score him War Patrol points, and he put it in the middle of the board so he could score War Patrol. And he rolls the Psychic action, and he rolls Boxcars, double 6s, Perils of the Warp. And because the Sentinels had exploded on him earlier and had done a mortal wound, he was only sitting at 2 HP. He rolls the D3 to see how much damage it actually does. And he rolled a 2. That means that the Warlock was supposed to be dead, and because it died from perils, explode, and would have killed one of the 2 D cannons that were in range. And at this point, he asks, I have 1 CP. Would you allow me to re-roll the psychic test? And I have to say, I was talking to a couple of friends about this. If I was playing at a high level table for a grand tournament, if I was already 3-0 at a GT, I would have said no. But this was a game I was already very confident I was winning. I was 1-0 at an RTT. I said, yes, you can. And I think for me, that was one of the big differences I had in like a sportsmanship thing. If I had said no, I would go from being, having a good game, just kind of punching somebody who is down, right? It's the kind of thing where it's like the winner of this game, we don't get that much off of it, right? It's just a little bit of pride. And I was already super confident I was going to win anyway. But it was one of those spots where he had already rolled, or he had forgotten to move the D cannon, so they were still in range of an explosion. He had already rolled how much damage he had gotten off of the Warlock, and it would have cost him like 5 points from Warp Ritual. And I did not think that was going to lead to a fun time. I did not think it would be good. And because I was still in a position where it's like, I'm so confident I'm going to win, this is an RTT, I gave it to him. Now, if anybody's here and if there's anybody in the comments, let me know what you think I should have done in that kind of spot, because I'm pretty confident I'm happy with my current decision, but if I was at a GT, I would have behaved differently. But anyway, finishing all that off, he gets it. I allow him to move the D cannons I allow him to move the D cannons first and then re-roll the psychic test, because like I have made no decisions here. Like the only thing that has really changed was what you would have done, and realistically, you should have already done all these things. And so we go through. He passes it. Warlock is alive. Quickens itself out, or someone else quickens it out of the middle of the board, and so he's maxed out his warp ritual at this point. The D cannons don't really do anything for the rest of the game, but they try. They moved forward, and at least they weren't dead. So, with that, I mean, the Exarch for Shining Spears does charge in, tags a couple of mortars, doesn't actually kill any of them, if I remember correctly. Maybe it picks up 1 mortar base, and then during my turn 4, I charge it with Lord Solar. Actually, don't kill it immediately. But, he gets to swing back, does a little bit of damage to Lord Solar, scores a little bit more behind enemy lines points, because I was not thinking as effectively as I should have. But either way, at that point, the game was effectively over. I put a bunch of fire down range with the Rogal Thorn into his Ranger squads. They both die. The Striking Scorpions, I don't remember exactly what they died to, but I blast them off the board with just like a bunch of small arms fire. And we just kind of talk the last part of the game out effectively on my turn 5. I just say, hey, these 4 mortars are going to go into that Warlock. These 5 mortars are going to go into that Warlock. Roll all the damage. They both die, and at the end of turn 5, the only thing that Jeff had left on the entire board was a single Warlock, the one that had originally perils and died in the middle of the board, but, I let him keep going. Put that, scored his final 4 points, and we end up winning game 2, 95-69. Again, this was one of those games where one of my biggest weaknesses as a player right now is not really understanding how far ahead or behind I am, right? Like, I can usually identify when I'm losing really well, but it's not always easy for me to know what tricks my opponents have to bring themselves back into the game. And so, honestly, great credit to Jeff for giving me a great game in game 2. Great opponent. He was giving me a lot of compliments on my current paint scheme and the things that I was doing with my army. I asked him afterwards, like, hey, is there anything that you thought I was dumb? And honestly, his response was, I actually think you could have tabled me faster. And that was one of the things that I will be working on to improve over time. But still, great game. Thanks to Jeff for bringing out the Eldari. It was a lot of fun for me, and hopefully it was fun for you as well. But already with that, we have already gone 2-0, and we have matched my performance at the first event that I went to at a previous RTT. And now we have to start looking at Game 3. So Game 3, we didn't have as much time to actually look at our opponent's list beforehand. I kind of looked very briefly at everybody's list that had already gone 1-0 that might have an opportunity to play me in the third round if I win. And so, who I matched into for Game 3 was Alberto and his Leagues of Votann, the little stubby-legged dwarfs. And he had an interesting list coming through. I know recently there was an article on Goonhammer where people talked about Thunderkin being very good and actually doing very well. I believe it was the Gameology Grand Tournament, very close to where I am here in Pasadena. But the list that Alberto was running was 2 Land Fortresses, 2 units of 3 Thunderkin with the, I believe, the Grav Cannons. They do a lot of damage. They're like long-range Meltaguns. 3 units of 3 Pioneers with Hylises and the works throughout them. 2 units of Hearthkin with just regular bolters and the Thane, I think they're called, whatever their sergeant is, with Power Sword and blah blah. He had a high call, the Brokir Forge Master, and 1 unit of 5 Hearthguard with the grenades and the Volkite. Shoot. Volkite rifles. I don't know. I don't know all the names of other people's stuff, so we'll figure that out later on. We were playing this last game on secure missing artifacts. And it is worth noting that because of the number of players, there were 2 tables that were currently playing with records of 2-0. And I knew that if I scored well enough on this game, I could actually win the entire event. So here, this was going to be one of the things, or one of the armies that I was actually most familiar playing against because I have one of my good friends does play a lot of Votann, and I have played up against a lot of games. However, I had never played against a Thunderkin, and I had never played against a list that had 2 Land Fortresses. And so I was a little bit worried about how this one was actually going to go. But one of the things that I do know about Ymir and Votann in general is they don't have a lot of chaff. They don't have a lot of cheap units that they can actually use to screen themselves. And crucially, a couple of things happened. One, I actually realized that we were playing on Secure Missing Artifacts. Secure Missing Artifacts is a objective-based game that is, again, control 1, control 2, control more with precious artifacts, where you will point at one of your opponent's objectives, and if they control that at the end of their turn, they will score 3 victory points off of it. Now, I'd actually played a game up against the same friend that was like, hey, you should probably put some Leman Russ is in reserve. And he had done a really cool trick to me with his terrain placement, whereby he had taken one of his terrain pieces, because after you move the objective, after all the terrain has gone down, it cannot end its move within terrain. And so, with only a 6-inch move, I put one of my pieces of terrain in such a way that he could not pull either of my objectives out of cover. So I was guaranteed to have both of my objectives have some obscuring cover around them. But my opponent hadn't done that, and I don't want to say it won the game, but I definitely think it helped quite a bit, because when he moved his objective, he moved 1 back. I moved one of his objectives forward, so that it was only being covered by dense cover and no obscuring cover was in between it. I had this massive firing lane down the center of the board, and then I moved one of my objectives back, and then he moved the one objective that he could that I had already done the terrain trick with. He moved it so that it was kind of exposed, but I was still going to be in a spot where I could just plop a couple infantry down, they would place a banner, and I would be able to control it the entire game, because he had no line of sight. He had no way to get over there. And so, as we started deploying, I deployed, again, relatively conservatively. I only held a couple of Cadians and Khazarkan squad in reserve. Didn't really have a whole lot off of it, but I did the same thing as I have done for most of my games. Sentinel, the Flamer Alpha Strike in the middle of the board, ready to go forward. Other 2 Sentinels kind of spread out because this Votann list doesn't have any forward deploy, and I don't know if the faction has any forward deploy, actually. I was able to create these really big bubbles with my Sentinels of, you can't move here. And something I learned from Alberto is that apparently the Pioneers, the bikes, while they do have a 12-inch pregame move, they cannot end that pregame move within 9 inches of any enemy units. And that's huge, because when I have so many Sentinels just kind of controlling the middle of the board, that means I can't really move into the middle of the board at all. That's crazy. So I didn't even know about that, but I already kind of locked it down and prevented anything from happening. For secondaries, again, I kind of forgot about this. He took Lay Claim, where I have to put 3 objectives down, and he gets 5 points for each one he controls at the end of the game. Ancestors are watching, kill things in different phases that have judgment tokens, and bring it down. And then mine, again, same as the other 2 games, Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Raise Banners. But as we deployed, I was fairly conservative once again. But I win the roll off and I go first, and it probably won me the game on the spot. Because the first thing that I did was I measured out all the places. He did all of his bikes, like where can they go. He moved them backwards into his own deployment zone. But he gave me enough room to hit the Kazarkin bomb. Lord Solar points at Kazarkin, give them full rerolls to hit and wound, but not against Votank because Void Armor. And also, first ring fire, second ring fire. 30 shots, effectively, that you can put at 15-inch range with the volley guns and 24-inch range with the actual las guns. Also, the Sentinels were able to march up into his deployment zone and do a bunch of damage. And so, on my first turn, by plopping my Kazarkin down on one side of the board and marching up my Sentinels on turn 1, what I was able to do was I killed, I think it was 6 Pioneer bikes, 3 Hearthguard, and tie up one of the land fortresses and tar pit it a little bit with my Sentinels. And I just want to put something in context real quick for like how much damage that was on turn 1 in a game where nothing else was shooting except I did like the mortars were in range. It was just the Sentinels and the Kazarkin, which are 100 points and 1 CP for the Barbican's Key, and then 2 CP for the Ingrained Precision and Overcharged Last Cells. For that cost, I did almost 400 points of damage with 235 points of mine. I killed 6 bikes, 3 Hearthguard, and I prevented his land fortress from shooting for a turn. That's nuts. That's crazy. Like, Astra Militarum is a good army, and the Kazarkin Bomb is probably one of the least fun parts about it for the opponent. It's very fun for me to do, but with a data slate change coming out soon, I expect that is probably going to get toned down at least a little bit. Either way, on his turn 1, or I don't really move out a whole lot of my own deployment zone, but on his turn 1, his land fortress that didn't get tied down with the Sentinels moves out and places itself in such a way they can shoot at one of my Leman Russ battle tanks. Everything else shoots at the Sentinels. 2 of them explode. And they do a bit more chip damage. I think they took down like a Hearthkin or 2. Did a little bit of damage to the land fortress, but it got healed up by the Baroque here Forge Master almost right away. But still, just that little bit of extra damage kind of like all over the place. Just so strong. Just so hard for him to deal with. But anyway, he does get a little bit of luck on his turn. And even after my first turn, he's already like, all right, well, I'm going to play this one out. Hopefully I can get as many points as possible and maybe find a podium spot, right? Because there's going to be 2 players who are 3-0, but whoever has a 2-1 record and the most points scored will get third and will win, I believe, with a little bit of store credit in order to actually buy things later on. But, to his credit, good sport. He was not happy about it, but, as he reminded me, he's like, I'm not upset at you. I'm just a little bit upset at how dumb this mechanic is, and honestly, I can't disagree with him. Anyway, he gets a little bit of luck. His land fortress pokes his head out around the side, and guys, he rolled so freaking well. His land fortress has effectively like 12 bolter shots that are AP2, and he popped his head around, and he put them into the Leman Russ, and they were shooting through dense, so they were hitting on 3s because he gave it the +1 ballistic skill, and he hit 9 of them. Okay, and then he wounded with 6 of them. And like he's already rolling really well. And then I rolled my saves. I didn't bother doing a blade of plating because I didn't think it was going to matter. And I failed 5 of them. that means his bolters did 10 damage to my Leman Russ battle tank. And then he hit with his railgun and finished off the tank. But I did some math afterwards, and I was like, oh my god, did I need to blow a blade of plating here? Did I need to spend 2 CP to keep this Leman Russ alive? And I did some mental math afterwards and realized that no, because I rolled so poorly, because all of my saves were on 1s and 2s, a blade of plating still would have resulted in the Leman Russ battle tank dying. But honestly, like, it was a great roll. He took down a Leman Russ battle tank, which was about 170 points, I believe, that he just like took off the field. But I had still done so much damage that it was still like small victories here and there. Other thing he does, is he takes down all the sentinels, but I've already crippled like so much of his mobility. He's got like 3 bikes and like 1 2-man units left, and his teleport backline threat from his Terminators, his Hearthguard, basically removed from the game. So I'm pretty confident that the game is over. Very similar to going up against the Eldar. I know that my objectives, or my secondary objectives, are so good at scoring me passive points that I don't really need to do a whole lot to actually win. And so I start playing pretty cagey. I basically just like hold everything basically in reserve. That's like, and Alberto would compliment me after the game. It's like, yeah, you did a really good job at knowing what didn't need to do anything in order to actually win the game. And so on my turn 2, one of the most important things that happened was I was able to park one of my sentinels on the middle objective. So I controlled the 2 on my side, I controlled my precious artifacts, I controlled my other home one, and then I controlled the middle one. So I was able to score a full 12 points on primary in that regard. And maybe I didn't need to score 12 there. I probably should have only scored 8, but still, small things can change the scope of the game. Ultimately, I didn't do a whole lot for the next several turns, right? The big thing was that as a bunch of his Hearthkin like spilled out of his land fortresses on turn 1 and moved over towards his precious artifacts, his special objective, in order to score some points there, basically all I did on that turn was I annihilated them, right? I ended up taking 2 Leman Russes and the Rogel Dorn and a little bit of like Mortar Fire, and I picked up the other 19 Hearthkin that had spilled out into the middle of the board because they were only being protected by dense cover, right? I had so much firepower that I could levy towards them that they were just all dead. And so with 20 Hearthkin gone, 1 land fortress just kind of milling about in his backline, and only 3 bikes running around, I was also able to pick up 1 more bike. And so he was only sitting there with 2 bikes, the 2 land fortresses, a Call, the Baroque Forge Master, and then his Thunderkin. That was his entire army after the end of turn 2. On turn 2, he tried to be a little bit more aggressive as well. Excuse me, not turn 2. On turn 3, Alberto tried to be a bit more aggressive. Because again, I was playing super cage. I'm like, I don't need to do anything to win this game. All right, as long as I can kind of control this middle objective, like I'll get 12 points. If I don't, then I'm still sitting on 2 objectives. I'm scoring 4 for my home, 4 for the special objective, and an additional 3 for the special objective. So I'm scoring 11 primary points per turn. Like, I'm going to be very close, if not maxing out primary on this game. And, of course, I'm going to be close to maxing out secondary as well. He needs to come to me in order to make things happen. So on turn 3, he makes his big play. He drops out both sides of Thunderkin and spends a CP in order to move the map to the Call over towards them so that they do have reroll 1s around them. And they take me off the center objective. They blow up, I believe it's 2 Leman Russes on this turn, and like, I'm a little bit worried at this point because I can no longer deal with the land fortresses. I do not have the firepower to punch through the toughness 8, just the raw number of wounds, plus the Baroque Forge Master, just creating so much pressure with the fact that it can heal it and also turn a damage roll to 0 at some point over the course of the turn. So at that point, I'm a little bit worried, but he leaves his Thunderkin out in the open. He tries to go for 9-inch charge. This has been a theme today. Fails it there as well, and I end up picking them up off the board on the next turn. Turn 4, mostly just mortar shooting things. I am at this point hiding my 1 remaining tank in the Rogel Dorn behind obscuring ruins because it doesn't need to do anything. It's not going to be out trading the land fortress all on its own, especially with the Brokir Forge Master over there. And I just need to keep it. I actually park it on top of one of his lay claim objectives. And I probably could have played that a tiny bit better, but it is what it is. All the Thunderkin were dead. The call was dead. And on turn 5, I walk into turn 5 with about a 38 point lead, something like that. And I know that with lay claim and just going second and the amount of mobility he has left, because he has one bike, one land fortress controlling one objective, and the ability to move into the middle objective and control the center objective, as well as his middle lay claim, he's going to be scoring at the very least 4 for controlling the middle objective, 5 for controlling the lay claim, and 4 for controlling one of the other objectives. But I was trying to deny one of those lay claim with a unit of Cadian shock troopers over there. And the other lay claim I didn't think he could really get to. But what he was able to, well, what he and we agreed upon was that his one bike that had one wound remaining would need to move over, would need to charge the Rogel Dorn, and not die in order to actually control the last lay claim for an additional 5 points. And so what happens is my one unit of Cadian shock troopers, I figure that has a chance of actually staying alive if I use Cadia's stands and try and make sure that they can survive. He has, I believe it's a call or some character, the land fortress, and just the, I believe it's the Hylas from the Pioneer that can all shoot at them. And he rolls really well. He actually picks up the entire squad before the land fortress even shoots. So he ends up taking that. He scores 5 points from that lay claim objective. Then he charges. I can't overwatch because of line of sight. He charges his Pioneer into the Rogel Thorn, and I announce, hey, I do have a stratagem. I can make it okay in combat. It will have Crush them. This means that it will be hitting on 3s, and 6s to wound will give a mortal wound. If I roll any 6s to wound, that is a dead bike, and I will deny him 5 points from there. Roll my dice. Hit 4 times on 6 dice. And then I roll, again, a strength 8 versus toughness 5. I just need 3s to wound. I end up only rolling 2 4s. So no mortal wounds. The bike doesn't instantly die. And he makes both saves. And he gets the last 5 points. And so what ends up happening is he controls his precious artifacts, so the special objective. He controls 3 objectives across the map, so he gets the 12 points there. So that's 15 points on primary. Then he scores all 3 of his late claim objectives for 15 points there. So that is already 30 points that he has scored on the last turn. But the thing that killed him was the fact that I still had 4 judgment tokens across all of my units. So that was a -4. And so he had a 26-point turn 5. But it wasn't enough. Like I said, I was up about 38 points before the last turn actually started, and I end up winning Game 3, 91-77. And honestly, I thought the game was over on turn 1. Right, the amount of damage that I had done, the amount of difficulty I had provided to my opponent, and just sitting in their movement zones and just like making sure that things couldn't move and shoot, could not really do anything. I thought the game was over. And I want to give Alberto a lot of praise for actually, one, giving me a lot of headaches throughout the game, right? Like, he rolled really well, picked up a couple Lehman Russes. The Thunderkin were way more strong than I was kind of expecting them to be going into the game. And he gave me a game, despite the amount of damage that I had done on turn 1. And honestly, props to Alberto for doing that. But that was a situation where I had now won all 3 of my games. At this point, if you are coming back and just skipped ahead towards the end, the summary, I did go 3-0. I won on tiebreakers to actually take first at the event. And I won the whole thing. Astra Militarum was able to take down, in order, Salamander Space Marines, Eldar, or Inari Eldar, and Ymir Conglomerate Leagues of Votann. and it did put me in a position where I won the whole thing. So I want to talk really briefly about things that I learned at the event and things that I am going to be looking forward doing better in future events. And so the first learning thing that I had was, wow, my army is really, really good. Partly it's list building, but more importantly than that, it is the fact that our book of rules gives me an advantage against most other armies just kind of off the bat. And there's a lot of really good mission rules for me as well in terms of objectives that I can take, and my secondaries are very strong. So it's easy for me to score points as long as I am controlling my side of the board. And that is something that the Imperial Guard, the Astronaut Army, has kind of always been pretty good at. As long as that is the case, we will see what happens with an upcoming data slate change that will be expected to happen on Thursday. But what did I learn? I actually learned I can be a bit more aggressive, right? As long as I'm taking control of the mid board, I should be quite strong on a lot of different mission types, a lot of different terrain setups against a lot of different armies. And so when I start looking at this in general, I'm going to start being a little bit more aggressive with my tanks. I think I'm valuing their lives a little bit too much, and it's creating situations where I can beat my opponents faster in games where I'm winning and deny them scoring any points, deny them opportunities to come back in a lot of these games. I did make a couple of decisions for fun, like, hey, I'm going to have Lord Solar charge this thing, ha 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 ha. Okay, well, cool. All right, Lord Solar either won or he didn't. And it was a situation where if I had taken those games seriously, or those small decisions a bit more seriously, there would have been even less of a chance for my opponents to come back in. But again, being a little bit more aggressive in terms of how my list performed, it's not the most straightforward list. It does require me to make a couple of decisions that are a bit risky. Not necessarily, okay, maybe not risky, but like it does force me to make decisions. When am I going to be using my Barbican's Key? How do I deploy Lord Solar and the Kazarkin so that they are close together? How do I deploy these Scout Sentinels? What do I need to tack up? What am I going to be hitting with Flamers in order to get the maximum value out of them? But overall, very happy with how the list has been performing. I will need to think about whether or not I want to continue with all 5 of the Sentinels that I have, or if I want to instead potentially drop in uh, another unit of like Cadian shock troops or something. Try and scrounge around for points to get one more infantry in it in order to have a bit better screen and one extra set of bodies in order to do actions throughout the course of the event. But I was very happy with how it performed. It did everything I kind of wanted it to, and already we're starting to look towards the next event. And as I check for that really quick, as I said, I'm going to events every single weekend for the next 5 weekends. And so the next one that we have going up is going to be the Gameology Pasadena Warhammer 40k Bolter and Taxes RTT on April 15th. I'm still going to be bringing guard to that one, but exactly what the list will be is still up for decisions. And so, as we close out episode 1 of Joshi's Journey in 40k, we ended off with winning an RTT. Thank you guys all for listening, and we will see you guys all next week.